The hammer didn't just slip from Emma Delgado's fingers. It felt like the world pushed it. It struck her foot with a sick, cracking thud that echoed in the vast Wyoming silence. She hissed, a sound like a snake, as white-hot pain shot up her leg. She stumbled back, catching herself just before she crashed into the crooked skeleton of a home she and her boys had been wrestling with since sunrise. The wind, a cold and heartless thing, tore at her shawl and threw dust in her eyes. It wanted her to cry. She wouldn't give it the satisfaction. "Mama?" Sam's voice, thin and sharp with panic, cut through the wind. Her 8-year-old boy ran to her, his face a mess of concern. Behind him, 6-year-old Lucas was trying to hold up a warped beam that was twice his size, his little body trembling with the effort. And then there was Gracie, just 4, sitting in the dirt, making tiny houses out of pebbles and bent nails, completely lost in her own small world. "I'm fine," Emma lied, her voice tight. The throbbing in her foot felt like a drumbeat of failure. "Just slipped. Keep going, boys. We need to get this wall up before we lose the light." Sam looked like he wanted to argue, but the look in his mother's eyes was harder than any nail. It was steel. He turned back to the beam, his small shoulders squared with a responsibility no child should have to carry. Emma limped toward him, forcing herself not to show how much it hurt. The sky above was a brilliant, cruel blue. This was the beauty of the high plains, a beauty that felt like a threat. Winter was coming. You could smell it in the air, a scent of ice and endings. Every sunset stole more of their time. This patch of worthless land on the edge of Red Hollow was all she had left. She'd bought it for almost nothing with the last of the money from her husband's death. No house, no well, no friends. Just hard earth, a howling wind, and the silent, judging eyes of a town that had already written her off. But it was hers, and if she had to, she would build a life from the dirt up. "Hold it steady," she grunted to Sam, pushing her weight against the beam. Her hands were a roadmap of blisters and splinters. The wood groaned, it wobbled, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought it would all come crashing down. Then, with a final, shuddering thud, it fell into place. It wasn't straight. It wasn't pretty. But it was standing. Sam's face broke into a grin. "You did it, Mama!" Emma allowed herself a half-smile, a tiny crack in her armor. "We did it, mijo." But she felt it then. A prickle on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She scanned the ridge that overlooked their small plot of land, and there, almost a silhouette against the harsh sun, was a man on a horse. He was perfectly still, motionless, just watching them. Her blood ran cold. Who was he, and what did he want? From his vantage point on the ridge, Graham Whitaker kept the reins slack in his hand. He shouldn't be here. He had 1,000 acres to manage, cattle to check, fences that needed mending. But for the 3rd day in a row, he'd found himself on this same hill, his gaze pulled down to the woman and her children below. They were like ants, trying to build a mountain out of dust. There was a fire in her. He could see it in the way she moved, a stubborn grace that refused to break. He'd seen people come to Red Hollow with big dreams. He'd seen them leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs when the first blizzard hit. But this woman? She wasn't running. She was digging in her heels. He saw the limp the second it happened, saw her drop the hammer, saw her lie to her children. Still, she got back up. Still, she lifted and hammered and commanded her little army of boys. She even managed a kind word for the little girl when the wind blew her pebble house over. She reminded him of someone he'd tried hard to forget. The wind bit at his face, and he adjusted the brim of his hat. He knew her name, Emma Delgado. In a town as small as Red Hollow, secrets were a luxury no one could afford. A widow from down south. Husband died in a mine collapse. Came north with 3 kids and a wagon that was barely holding together. She hadn't asked anyone for a single thing, just bought the most useless piece of land in the valley and started building. It was the kind of story that made people uncomfortable. fool woman, Graham muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was talking to himself, or maybe to the wind. That shack won't last a week. He meant it to be a cold, hard fact, but something inside him fought against it. She was doing everything right. She was working harder than any man he'd ever hired, and it still wasn't going to be enough. That simple, brutal truth chewed at him. Down below, Emma knelt by the small fire pit they'd dug. He could see her trying to hide her swollen foot from her kids. He watched them share their dinner, a couple of potatoes and a can of beans. It was nothing, but it was warm. And out here, warm was everything. "Think we'll have a roof next week, Mama?" he heard the oldest boy ask. He saw her hesitate, saw her eyes drift to the skeletal frame behind them, a ghost of a house against the dying light. "If we work hard," she said, her voice carrying faintly on the wind, "one plank at a time." The children's laughter that followed was a sound so pure and hopeful it felt like a punch to Graham's gut. It was a sound he hadn't heard in his own grand, empty house in years. He jerked the reins, turning his horse with a sudden, violent motion. He rode back toward his ranch, trying to outrun the feeling that was clawing its way up his throat. The sun bled out of the sky, and the temperature plummeted. Courage couldn't stop frostbite. Willpower couldn't build a roof. Graham Whitaker hadn't helped another soul without a contract in 20 years. Not unless it involved land, or profit, or leverage. Help was a transaction. Kindness was a weakness. But as he rode into the growing darkness, the image of that woman and her children was burned into his mind. He didn't know her, not really, but he was starting to realize something terrifying. He couldn't just do nothing, and he had no idea why. That night, the big house on the Whitaker ranch felt more like a tomb than a home. Long after the lamps burned out and the fire died, Graham stood at his study window, staring out into the blackness. He couldn't see her little plot of land from here, but it didn't matter. He could feel it. The half-built shack, the dying fire, the children huddled together against a cold that was only going to get worse. A hard frost had already come, turning the grass to silver daggers. The first snow wasn't a question of if, but when. It could be a week. It could be tomorrow. And that house she was building with her bare, bleeding hands. It was a death trap. He poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He was a man of boundaries, of clear lines drawn in the dirt. You stayed on your side, I stay on mine. He didn't get involved. But this was different. It wasn't pity, and it certainly wasn't some foolish attraction. She was a handsome woman, in a hard, weathered sort of way, but that wasn't it. This was something else, something that felt dangerously close to responsibility. He didn't want to own her struggle. He didn't want to be her savior. He just couldn't stand by and watch her fail. Not when he had sheds full of lumber, barrels of nails, entire crates of window panes just sitting there, gathering dust. Not when he had the power to change the outcome. Before the sun had even thought about rising, he was on his horse, riding toward the north end of his property. He unlocked the supply shed, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the cold air. There was enough material in here to build 3 cabins. His next stop was a small cottage on the edge of town. He pounded on the door until a light flickered inside. Eli Barnes, the best carpenter in the county, opened the door, bleary-eyed and scratching a thick gray beard. "Whitaker?" Eli grumbled. "What in God's name are you doing here? It ain't even dawn." "I need you to do something," Graham said, his voice flat. Eli leaned against the doorframe, instantly suspicious. "A favor? From you? The world must be ending." "Close enough," Graham said. "It's for the widow, the one out on the West Ridge, Emma Delgado." Eli's expression changed. The suspicion softened into something like concern. "Ah, the woman trying to build a castle out of twigs. She's a proud one. Won't take charity." "She won't know it's from me," Graham said. Eli raised an eyebrow. "So you want me to just show up with a wagon full of lumber and tell her it fell from the sky?" "I'll pay you for 3 weeks' work. Full rates plus extra. I'll provide every last nail. You just deliver it, help her build, and you keep my name out of your mouth." Eli chewed on that for a long moment, his eyes studying Graham's face in the faint pre-dawn light. "Why? What's your angle here, Graham? There's always an angle." Graham's jaw tightened. "She's building something from nothing. I've seen it before, and I know what happens when the first blizzard hits." He paused. "Just do it, Eli. Tell her it was an anonymous donation to the town, and the council decided she was the most deserving. Lie if you have to. Just get it done." Eli let out a long sigh. He knew better than to argue when Graham used that tone. "All right, I'll load up the wagon after breakfast. But if she runs me off her land with a shotgun, I'm sending her to you." "She won't," Graham said, turning to leave. But as he rode away, a new unsettling thought took root. He'd told Eli to lie. But what if the lie itself was the problem? What if, instead of giving her a helping hand, he was actually handing her a whole new set of troubles? The town of Red Hollow fed on gossip like a pack of starving wolves, and an anonymous gift this big wouldn't stay anonymous for long. It would have a story attached to it. And in that story, Emma Delgado wouldn't be the hero. She'd be the victim. Or worse. The distant rumble of a wagon pulled Emma from her work. She set down her hammer, her body instantly tense. A flatbed wagon loaded high with stacks of clean, fresh lumber was making its way up the dirt track to her land. A gray-bearded man she didn't recognize was holding the reins. He pulled the mules to a stop a few yards away and tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am. Name's Eli Barnes. Got a delivery for you." Emma's eyes narrowed. "I didn't order any delivery." "Maybe not," Eli said, hopping down from the wagon. "But it's for you. All of it. Paid in full." He gestured to the incredible pile of building materials. Straight pine boards, sacks of nails, bundles of shingles, even 2 crated window frames. It was a fortune. Her stomach coiled into a tight knot. "Paid for by who?" Eli gave a convincing shrug. "Don't know. Man came to me last night, paid in cash. Said the town council voted. An anonymous donation for a family in need. They chose you." The story sounded plausible, almost. But Emma had been in Red Hollow long enough to know the town council wouldn't give a stray dog a bone, let alone give her a house. This wasn't charity. It was something else. Something with strings attached. "I don't accept handouts," she said, her voice like ice. "Ain't a handout, ma'am," Eli replied calmly. "The council decided. It's yours. My instructions are to help you build it, if you'll have me. No cost to you." Her hands balled into fists at her sides. She could feel the blood rushing to her cheeks. Was this some rich man's game? A way to put her in his debt? To own her? The whispers would start before the first nail was hammered. The widow Delgado, taking gifts from a secret benefactor. They would strip her of the one thing she had left. Her dignity. She looked over at her children, who had stopped their work and were watching, their eyes wide. Then she looked back at the lumber. It was enough to build a real home, a warm, safe place for her babies to sleep through the winter. It was a roof. It was survival. She hated it, and she needed it more than she needed her next breath. She turned back to Eli, her eyes hard as stone. "You tell the council, you tell whoever sent this, that I'm not a woman who takes things for free. If I use this lumber, it's a loan. I will find out who paid for it, and I will repay every last cent." Eli let out a low whistle. "All right, ma'am. I'll pass the message on. And one more thing," she added, her voice unwavering. "If you stay to help, you work for me. I work beside you. Every board, every nail. This is my house. I'm the one building it." Eli looked her up and down, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Yes, ma'am. I wouldn't have it any other way." From his hiding spot in the trees, Graham watched the scene unfold. He saw her pride, her anger, her desperate, cornered defiance. She hadn't sent Eli away, but she hadn't accepted the gift either. She'd turned it into a debt, a battle. He had tried to give her an advantage, and instead, he'd just handed her a new enemy to fight. Him. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. This was already more complicated than he'd ever intended. And it was just getting started. The next morning, the frost on the ground was so thick it crunched under Eli Barnes's boots. He arrived to find Emma already at work, her sleeves rolled up, a scarf wrapped tight around her head. The children were there too, little soldiers ready for their orders. Emma just gave him a nod, and they got to work. She was incredible. She didn't just work hard, she worked smart. She'd already figured out which wall would take the worst of the wind and needed the most bracing. Her chalk lines were straight, her measurements exact. She moved with a purpose that Eli hadn't seen in a long, long time. "You've done this before," Eli said, trying to make conversation as they raised the first section of the east wall. "No," she said, not looking at him. "Learned because I had to." He respected her silence. He respected her grit. By midday, they'd made more progress than Emma had made in the previous week. Sam and Lucas passed them boards and nails, their faces flushed with pride. Even little Gracie was helping, sorting nails into piles. But something wasn't right. As they were setting a heavy beam, Eli felt the support beneath it shift. It was subtle, just a slight give that shouldn't have been there. He caught the beam before it could fall. "Whoa there," he said. "Post must have settled." Emma frowned, coming over to inspect it. The post they had set firmly in the ground the day before was now loose, wobbling in its hole. It looked like the dirt around it had been deliberately dug out and then loosely refilled. "The ground here is hard," Emma said slowly, her eyes scanning the area. "It wouldn't just settle." Eli didn't say anything, but he knew she was right. Someone had done this. He helped her reset the post, packing the dirt back in until it was rock solid. They went back to work, but the easy rhythm of the morning was gone. Now there was a new tension in the air, a feeling of being watched, of being threatened. Later that afternoon, it happened again. Emma sent Sam to the nail sack for more 3-inch nails. He came back a minute later, his face pale. "Mama," he whispered, "they're gone." Emma strode over to the large canvas sack. It had been nearly full that morning. Now it was empty, not just the 3-inch nails, all of them. Gone. Vanished into thin air. "Are you sure this is where you left them?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Yes, ma'am," Sam said, his lip trembling. "Right here. This wasn't an accident. First the post, now the nails. Someone was sabotaging them. Someone was trying to stop this house from being built." Emma's mind immediately went to the man on the ridge, the watcher, Graham Whitaker. Was this his game? To give her hope with one hand and snatch it away with the other? To make her fail, just to prove he was right about her? The whispers started that very same day. When Emma had to walk into town to buy more nails she couldn't afford, the looks she got were different. They weren't just curious anymore. They were hostile. Mrs. Gable, who ran the bakery, turned her back when Emma walked past. 2 ranchers standing outside the saloon stopped talking and just stared at her, their expressions a mixture of contempt and pity. "Folks are saying things," Eli said quietly when she got back, his face grim. "I know," Emma snapped, her hands shaking as she ripped open the new sack of nails. "What are they saying, Eli?" He hesitated. "They're saying this lumber wasn't a gift from the council. They're saying it's from Whitaker." Emma froze. Why would they say that? Because one of his ranch hands was in town, bragging. Said the boss felt sorry for the poor widow and was setting her up in a new house. Said he was looking after her. The words hit her like a slap. Looking after her. She knew exactly what that meant. They thought she was his charity case, his property. They thought she'd sold herself for a roof over her children's heads. The sabotage suddenly made a twisted kind of sense. Maybe it wasn't Whitaker himself. Maybe it was the town. Maybe it was their wives, jealous and cruel. Or maybe it was someone who hated Whitaker and wanted to hurt him by hurting her. Her pride, the only thing she had left, was being dragged through the mud. "I should have said no," she whispered, her voice cracking. I should have sent you and that lumber right back to hell where it came from." "You couldn't have," Eli said gently. "Your kids needed a roof. You made the only choice you could." "My choice?" she said, her voice rising with a cold, hard anger. "It wasn't my choice, it was his. He did this to me. He put this target on my back." She looked at the half-built house, and for the first time, she didn't see a home. She saw a cage, a symbol of her humiliation. From the ridge, hidden in the shadows of the pines, Graham watched her. He saw the empty nail sack. He saw the fury on her face. He had set this in motion, thinking he was doing something good, something quiet and decent. But he had been a fool. In a town like Red Hollow, there were no quiet decencies. There were only secrets and power. And he had just handed all the power to the gossips and the bullies. He saw Emma pick up her hammer, her knuckles white. She wasn't just building a house anymore. She was preparing for a war. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was coming for him next. She didn't wait. The next morning, Emma Delgado walked the 5 miles into town. She didn't bother with a clean dress. She wore her work clothes, stained with dirt and sweat, her boots coated in dust. Her swollen foot ached with every step, a dull, angry reminder of her struggle. She didn't care. The pain fueled her. Red Hollow was just waking up, but the whispers followed her like her own shadow. She ignored them. She had one destination, one target. She found him standing outside the feed store talking to the mayor, Graham Whitaker. He looked just as she remembered from the ridge, tall, powerful, radiating an aura of untouchable authority. She didn't hesitate. She walked right up to them, her footsteps loud in the quiet morning air. "Mr. Whitaker." He turned, and for a split second, she saw surprise flicker in his eyes before it was replaced by a calm, unreadable mask. The mayor, sensing trouble, mumbled an excuse and scurried away. "Mrs. Delgado," Graham said, his voice even. "Don't you Mrs. Delgado me," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage. "You did this. You, with your secret gift and your pity. You put my name in every gossip's mouth in this town." Graham's jaw tensed. "That was not my intention." "I don't care about your intentions," she shot back, taking a step closer. People on the street were stopping to watch now, pretending not to listen. "You think you can just throw your money around and fix things? You think a pile of lumber makes up for what you did?" A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "What I did? I was trying to help." "Help?" She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You call this help? Sabotaging my work? Turning the whole town against me? Making them think I'm your... She couldn't even say the word. Now he looked genuinely bewildered. "Sabotage? What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me," she spat. "The loose post, the stolen nails, that was you, wasn't it? Trying to teach me a lesson? To show me I can't survive without you?" Graham stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than calm authority in his eyes. She saw a crack in the fortress. "I swear to you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I had nothing to do with that. I would never—" "Then who did?" she demanded. "Your jealous wife? Your enemies?" He flinched, a barely perceptible movement, but she saw it. "I don't have a wife." "Then it all comes back to you," she said, pressing her advantage. "This is your fault. All of it." He looked away then, his gaze sweeping over the gawking faces of the townspeople. He looked back at her, and his expression had hardened again, but in a different way. It was resignation. It was shame. "You're right," he said, the admission stunning her into silence. "It is my fault, but not for the reasons you think." He took a deep breath. "This isn't about pity, Mrs. Delgado. It's about a debt." "A debt?" "Yes," he said, his eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a bleakness she didn't understand. "I owned the mine, the one where your husband—" He didn't have to finish the sentence. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady. Graham Whitaker. He wasn't just some rich rancher. He was the man responsible for her husband's death. The lumber, the house. It wasn't a gift. It was blood money. You, she breathed, the anger draining out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. There was a structural issue we knew about, Graham said, his voice strained. We were supposed to shut down that shaft. I delayed, for profit. Your husband and 5 other men paid the price for my greed. The story was suddenly so much darker, so much more twisted than she could have ever imagined. The house wasn't a cage. It was a tombstone, a monument to his guilt. So this is your penance? She asked, her voice flat. You build me a house on my husband's grave. I'm trying to make it right, he said, his voice raw. Right? She choked out. Nothing you do will ever make it right. She turned and walked away, not caring that the entire town had heard every word. The whispers behind her were no longer about her virtue. They were about something much bigger. Murder. Greed. And the dark, ugly secret that the most powerful man in Red Hollow had just confessed to in the middle of the street. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her, heavy with a guilt that he could never wash away. She had come for a fight, and she had gotten one. But she hadn't won. Nobody had. She had just unearthed a truth that was uglier and more painful than any lie. And she knew deep in her bones that this was far from over. The truth had a way of demanding more than just a confession. It demanded justice, and she was the only one left to get it. The walk back to her land was a blur. Emma's mind was a storm of grief and fury. The man who had sent her a house was the same man who had made her a widow. The thought was a snake, coiling around her heart, squeezing until she could barely breathe. Every board, every nail now felt tainted, stained with her husband's blood. When she arrived, Eli was waiting for her, his face a mask of concern. He'd clearly heard the news. News traveled faster than a prairie fire in Red Hollow. Emma, he started, taking a step toward her. Did you know? She asked, her voice devoid of all emotion. When you brought that lumber, did you know who sent it and why? Eli's face crumpled. He looked down at his boots, unable to meet her gaze. I knew he owned the mine, he mumbled. I didn't know the rest. I swear it. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to take his tools and his pity and leave, but she couldn't. The walls were half built. Winter was still coming, and her children were inside the tent waiting for her. She was trapped by her need, trapped by Whitaker's guilt. She picked up her hammer and went back to work, driving nails with a savage, rhythmic fury. Each strike was a blow against him, against the injustice of it all. Eli worked beside her in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. 2 days later, a boy on a fast horse arrived with a letter. It was from Graham Whitaker. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It wasn't an apology. It was a summons. Mrs. Delgado, it read, I understand your anger, but there are matters we must discuss regarding the land you purchased. I believe there has been a misunderstanding about the ownership. I have asked the town council to convene a public hearing in 3 days' time. I urge you to be there. A misunderstanding about the ownership. What did that mean? She had the deed, signed, sealed, and filed with the county clerk. The land was hers. What fresh hell was this? She confronted Eli, thrusting the letter at him. What does he mean? What is this about? Eli read the letter, his brow furrowed. He looked older, more tired than he had a few days ago. I don't know, he said, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. He was lying. He knew something. Tell me, Eli, she demanded. You owe me that much. He let out a long, weary sigh. Before your husband, before the accident, he was in a bad way for money. He came to see Whitaker. Eli paused, choosing his words carefully. He made a deal. He sold the rights to this plot of land to Whitaker. He took the cash up front. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. No, that's not possible. He would have told me. The deal was private, Eli said softly. A gentleman's agreement. Whitaker has the contract, signed by your husband's own hand. He never filed it, out of respect, after. But the contract is legal. He owns this land, Emma, not you. The world spun. The house she was building, the home she was pouring her blood and tears into, wasn't even on her own land. She was a squatter, a trespasser on the property of the man who killed her husband. This was his game. It was all becoming sickeningly clear. The lumber wasn't blood money. The confession in the street wasn't about clearing his conscience. It was a public spectacle, a way to control the narrative. First, he makes the town see him as a guilty man trying to atone. Then he reveals the contract and takes the land, and the town will see him as a reasonable man, simply claiming what is rightfully his from a hysterical, ungrateful widow. He wasn't just going to take her home. He was going to take her dignity, her credibility, everything. He was going to leave her with nothing and make it look like he was the victim. The hearing wasn't a discussion. It was an execution. "He can't do this," she whispered, clutching the letter. "He can," Eli said, his voice heavy with pity. "And he will." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The wind howled around the half-finished cabin, sounding like the ghosts of the men who had died in that mine. She felt her husband's presence, not as a comfort, but as a question. Why, Daniel? Why would you sell our future? Desperate for an answer, for anything, she pulled out the old wooden chest where she kept his few belongings. A worn Bible, a handful of letters from his mother, his spare set of clothes. She'd been through it 100 times, but this time her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard inside the chest. Prying it up, she found a small, leather-bound journal she had never seen before. Her heart pounded as she opened it. It was Daniel's handwriting. Frantic, messy scrawls from the last few weeks of his life. She lit a lamp and began to read. The words on the page weren't about debt. They were about danger. "The supports in shaft 4 are rotten," he wrote. "Told Whitaker. He said to ignore it. The profits from that seam are too high to stop now." She read on, her horror growing with every page. Daniel hadn't been a victim of a tragic accident. He had been a whistleblower. He had been documenting the safety violations, gathering evidence against Whitaker. And then she found it. The entry from the day before he died. "Met with W again. He knows I have proof. He offered me money to keep quiet. A big sum. Tried to make me sign a contract. Something about the land, to make it look legitimate. A bribe. I told him I wouldn't be bought. I told him I was going to the federal inspector. He looked at me. He looked at me like I was already a dead man. The contract wasn't a sale. It was a bribe. A failed bribe. Her husband hadn't sold their future. He had died trying to protect it." Emma's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the journal. Whitaker hadn't just let her husband die. He hadn't just covered it up. He had a motive. He had wanted Daniel silenced. The mine collapse wasn't negligence. It was murder. But the final entry scrawled on the very last page was the one that made her blood run cold. It was just 2 words, a name. Eli knows. Eli, the kind, helpful carpenter. The man who had been working beside her day after day. The man who had looked her in the eye and lied. A wave of nausea washed over her. Eli wasn't just a carpenter. The journal mentioned him earlier. He had been the foreman at the mine, Whitaker's right-hand man. He had been there that day. The whole world shifted into a terrifying new focus. Eli's presence here wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't Whitaker's idea of penance. It was surveillance. He was here to watch her, to control her, to make sure she never found this journal. He was a guard, and her half-built house was her prison. The friendly face, the helping hands. It was all a lie. A monstrous, calculated lie. She was sleeping next to the enemy. Her children were playing at the feet of the man who had helped murder their father. She looked out the window of the tent, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the pale moonlight, she could see the silhouette of the cabin, her home, her fortress. And inside it, she could hear the gentle, even breathing of her children. They were all she had. She clutched the journal to her chest. This small book was the only weapon she had against the 2 most powerful men in the valley. The hearing was in 2 days. They thought she was coming to beg for mercy. They had no idea. She wasn't coming for mercy. She was coming for vengeance. The next 2 days were a masterclass in deception. Emma played the part of the broken widow perfectly. When Eli arrived for work, she was quiet and withdrawn, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying all night. She let him take the lead, handing him boards and tools with a numb, defeated air. He watched her with a look of pity that made her want to vomit. He thought he had her right where he wanted her, hopeless and helpless. He had no idea that beneath her placid surface, a cold, calculating fury was building. Every time he turned his back, she watched him, studying his movements, his habits. She was no longer just building a house, she was building a trap. The journal was hidden deep within the wall of the cabin, wrapped in oilcloth, a secret buried in the heart of her home. The night before the hearing, she couldn't eat. She sat by the fire, her children asleep inside the tent, and went over her plan again and again. It was a wild, desperate gamble. It could get her killed. But the thought of letting them win, of letting them desecrate Daniel's memory, was worse than death. The town hall was packed. It felt like every man, woman, and child in Red Hollow had come to watch the spectacle. They were there to see the mighty Graham Whitaker put the uppity widow in her place. Emma walked in with her head held high, her children trailing behind her like a tiny, solemn procession. She saw the smug looks, the pitying glances. Let them look. By the end of the day, they would be looking at her very differently. Graham Whitaker sat at a table at the front of the room, looking calm and authoritative. Eli Barnes stood behind him, his arms crossed, a loyal soldier at his master's side. The mayor called the meeting to order, his voice booming with self-importance. "We are here today," the mayor announced, "to resolve a regrettable dispute over the ownership of the plot of land on West Ridge, currently occupied by Mrs. Emma Delgado." Graham stood up. He spoke in a smooth, reasonable tone, his voice full of feigned regret. He told the council about Daniel's financial troubles, about his generous offer to help, about the contract Daniel had willingly signed. He painted himself as a benevolent patron, forced into this unfortunate position by a grieving and confused widow. He then produced the contract, a single sheet of paper that held her entire future in its ink. "As you can see," he said, handing it to the mayor, "this is Mr. Delgado's signature. The land is, by rights, mine. However, in light of Mrs. Delgado's tragic circumstances, I am prepared to be generous. I will allow her to remain on the property through the winter, provided she ceases construction immediately and vacates by the spring." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. "How kind, how merciful!" The mayor turned to her. "Mrs. Delgado, do you have anything to say?" This was it. Her moment. She stood up, her legs feeling surprisingly steady. She looked not at the mayor, but directly at Graham Whitaker. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent hall. "Mr. Whitaker is right. That is my husband's signature, but he has presented you with an incomplete document." A confused frown creased Graham's brow. "What are you talking about? That is the entire agreement." "No," Emma said, taking a step forward. "A contract requires context, and you seem to have forgotten to provide it. You see, this wasn't a land sale. It was a bribe." The room erupted in gasps. Graham's face went pale. "That is an outrageous accusation." "Is it?" Emma countered, her voice rising with power. "My husband wasn't in debt. He was a threat. He knew you were running an unsafe mine, Mr. Whitaker. He had proof that you were cutting corners on safety to increase your profits. He was going to expose you. This contract wasn't to buy my land. It was to buy his silence." Graham was on his feet now, his face a mask of fury. "This is slander. You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," she said, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. "A man who knows he's in danger, a man who knows he might not live to see the next sunrise. He doesn't just keep records, he keeps a journal." She saw the flicker of sheer panic in his eyes. He shot a desperate look at Eli. Eli, for his part, looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face had gone a sickly, ashen color. "This is absurd," Graham stammered, trying to regain control. A fictional story, cooked up by a desperate woman. Then let's talk to your star witness, Emma said, turning her gaze on the carpenter. Her voice dropped, becoming sharp as a razor. Let's talk to your mine foreman, Eli Barnes. Every eye in the room swiveled to Eli. He was sweating now, his big frame seeming to shrink under the weight of 100 stares. Eli, Emma said, her voice soft, almost conversational. My husband's journal says you knew. It says you were there when he threatened to expose Whitaker. It says, Eli knows. What is it that you know, Eli? Did you know that the supports in Shaft 4 were rotten? Did you know that my husband was going to the federal inspector the very next day? Eli was trapped. He looked from Emma's piercing gaze to Graham's frantic, warning expression. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Let me help you, Emma continued, her voice dripping with ice. You knew that if Daniel talked, you would both go down. Whitaker would lose his fortune, and you'd go to prison for negligence. So a bribe wasn't enough, was it? You had to make sure he was silenced. Permanently. She took another step toward him. The mine collapse, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It wasn't an accident, was it, Eli? It was so easy for you. A loosened timber here, a misplaced charge there. You didn't just let those men die. You murdered them to cover your tracks. Eli let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward. No! It wasn't me! It was his idea! He screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Graham. He told me to take care of it! He ordered it! The room exploded into chaos. Graham lunged toward Eli, his face contorted with rage. You lying coward! I told you to pay him off! I never told you to kill him! The two men were shouting, accusing, revealing more and more of their ugly conspiracy with every word. The townspeople looked on, horrified and riveted. The story was no longer about a land dispute. It was about murder, conspiracy, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of their community. Emma stood back and watched the fire she had started consume them both. She had walked in here with nothing but the truth in her hands, a truth she had literally torn from the walls of her own home. She had faced down two powerful men and made them destroy each other. The mayor, finally regaining his senses, slammed his gavel. Sheriff, arrest these men! As the sheriff led a protesting Graham and a sobbing Eli out of the hall, the room was silent. Everyone was staring at Emma, not with pity, not with suspicion, but with a new, dawning sense of awe. She had been a widow, an outsider, a charity case. Now she was a giant. She gathered her children, who were huddled together, their eyes wide. She took their hands and walked out of the town hall, leaving the wreckage of two men's lives behind her. The sky was a brilliant, clear blue, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, it didn't feel cruel. It felt like hope. The house on West Ridge wasn't a cage or a tombstone anymore. It was a fortress, and she was its queen. The trial was the only thing anyone in Red Hollow talked about for months. The things that came out, they were darker than anyone could have imagined. Graham Whitaker, it turned out, hadn't just been negligent. He had systematically bribed inspectors and silenced workers for years. His fortune was built on a foundation of lies and broken bodies. But the journal, and his own panicked outburst in the town hall, proved he had never ordered the murder. He was a greedy man, a criminal, but not a killer. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. Eli Barnes, the quiet carpenter, was another story. He confessed to everything. He admitted he had rigged the explosion in the mine, callously sacrificing 6 lives to protect himself and his boss. His gentle demeanor had hidden a monster. He would never see the outside of a prison wall again. The Whitaker ranch was broken up and sold off by the government to pay fines and create a restitution fund for the families of all the miners who had died under Graham's watch. It was a seismic shift in the valley. The power structure that had ruled Red Hollow for a generation was shattered overnight. And at the center of it all was Emma. The The town that had once scorned her now looked at her with a kind of fearful reverence. She had single-handedly brought down a king. People gave her a wide berth when she walked down the street. They offered her things, free goods from the store, help with the cabin, but she refused it all. She didn't want their charity or their guilt. She just wanted to be left alone to finish her house. She worked from sunup to sundown, her children by her side. They raised the last walls, set the roof beams, and painstakingly installed the glass in the windows. It was slow, back-breaking work, but every swing of the hammer felt different now. It was no longer an act of desperation. It was an act of creation. She was building her family's future on the ashes of her past. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she was nailing the final shingle onto the roof, a wagon pulled up. It was the sheriff. He got out and walked toward the house, holding his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Delgado," he said, looking up at her, "I have something for you." He handed her a thick envelope. Inside was the official deed to her land, free and clear, the title transferred to her by court order. But there was another document, too. It was a letter from a lawyer in Cheyenne. The court had awarded her a significant portion of the restitution fund. It wasn't just enough money to live on. It was a fortune. More money than she had ever dreamed of. She stared at the paper, her hands trembling. She had fought for justice, not for wealth. But here it was, a new life handed to her. She finished the roof, her mind reeling. That evening, as the sun set, she sat on the porch of her finished home. Her home, truly hers, in every sense of the word. Sam and Lucas were chasing each other in the yard, their laughter echoing in the cool, clean air. Gracie was asleep in her lap. The house was solid, the walls were straight, the windows looked out over a valley that was hers. She thought about Daniel. She thought about his courage, about the journal he had left behind, like a map to guide her through the darkness. She had not just built a house, she had built a monument to his memory. She had ensured his death was not in vain. She looked at the letter from the lawyer, at the staggering number written on it. She could leave. She could take her children and go anywhere, to a city with real schools and doctors. She could buy a grand house, one that was already built, with no ghosts in the walls. But as she looked out at the vast, empty beauty of the Wyoming landscape, she knew she wouldn't leave. This place had tested her, broken her, and reforged her. This hard, unforgiving land was where she had found her strength. This house, built with her own 2 hands, was the only palace she would ever need. The first snow came a week later. It fell softly, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. Emma stood at her window, a cup of hot coffee warming her hands, and watched it fall. The warmth from the stove filled the small cabin, a cozy, safe bubble against the cold. Her children were sitting at the table, drawing on pieces of paper. They were safe, they were warm, they were home. A story like this makes you wonder about the lines we draw between good and evil, between justice and vengeance. Emma Delgado fought for her family, for the truth, and in the end, she reshaped her entire world. She proved that one person's courage can indeed topple an empire. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next dive into the dark and mysterious corners of the human heart.